Nevertheless, many parents bought the statist argument that their duty to their community was more important than their duty to their children, and the purpose of public schools as instruments of social change first and academics second was quickly established. Though parents may not have known it, they were fulfilling the wildest dreams of Karl Marx and Frederick Engels, who wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1848 that they wanted to stop the exploitation of children by their parents by destroying the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. They wrote that the hallowed correlation of parents and child between the family and education was disgusting bourgeois claptrap. The next big player who was instrumental in applying this socialist statist education system to America was John Dewey, who furthered the demise of the neighborhood school and promoted the takeover of education by big industry and government via psychologically experimental methods. Dewey, like Mann, clearly understood the religious element that is inherent within education. Our schools, he said, are performing an infinitely religious work. They are promoting social unity. Religion associated with dogmatic beliefs we see disappearing. It is the part of man to work for the transformation of all practical instrumentalities of education till they are in harmony with these ideas. Underscoring the importance of Mann's earlier initiative to have the state teach the teachers, Dewey described teachers in almost Messiah-like terms. Every teacher should realize he is a social servant set apart for the maintenance of the proper social order and the securing of the right social growth. In this way, the teacher is always the prophet of the true God and the usherer in of the true kingdom of heaven. After taking over the teacher colleges, the next thing that these education statists had to do was to take charge of the textbooks that our children learned from. Gary North points out that what the textbook contains is not so important as what it leaves out. It leaves out evidence of rival views. The war for the minds of the next generation has been more carefully laid out by textbook committees than by any consortium or conspiratorial meeting behind closed doors. The textbook committees control by elimination. George Orwell wrote in his eerily accurate book, 1984, "Whoever controls the image and information of the past determines what and how future generations will think. Whoever controls the information and images of the present determines how these same people will view the past." Lester Frank Ward, the father of American Central Planning, who called education a systematic process for the manufacture of correct opinions, laid down the design template for school textbooks using this exclusion method. Our minds, he said, resist coercion to change our deep-seated opinions. But if educators, particularly those who wrote the textbooks that all schools would use, would eliminate any mention of competing ideas, nothing would be left in our minds but those opinions that the educators want us to have. And what ideas did those educators want us to have? Why, that there's nothing more important for us to learn while we are young than that which is necessary for us to go out, get a good job, and become productive members of society. Elsewhere in this course, you learn about a group of politicians, bankers, and businessmen who met in secret in 1913 on Jekyll Island, and how that meeting quite radically changed life in America. At around the same time as that fateful visit to Jekyll Island, many of these same players who gave us the Federal Reserve System were involved in other business ventures besides banking. They realized that they needed a cooperative, submissive, and well-trained workforce in order to accomplish their goals. Schools, then, were to play a vital role in producing these workers. In 1917, another meeting took place involving many of the same players, names like Rockefeller and Carnegie, that just as radically changed life and lifelong opinions in America by altering the direction of government-controlled schooling. This group, the Education Trust, included not only big players from the world of finance and big business, but also from the world of education. Names like Harvard and Stanford and the National Education Association. And their purpose, according to British evolutionist Benjamin Kidd, was to impose on the young the ideal of subordination. As former New York State Teacher of the Year John Taylor Gatto described it, students were to learn to think of themselves as employees competing for the favor of management, not as Franklin or Edison had once regarded themselves as self-determined free agents. No longer were rugged individualism and Yankee entrepreneurialism to be regarded as the strength and pride of America. Instead, young people were taught that their strength was to be found in submission to the greater good of the group, or as a backwards look at history shows, to the manpower needs of industrialists who had invested huge amounts of capital in new machinery that required factory workers to operate, and a new term was born: human resources. Frederick Gates, who John D. Rockefeller hired to oversee the spending of his vast riches, wrote in his book, The Country School of Tomorrow, "In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational functions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own good will upon a grateful and responsive rural folk." But none of those limitless resources were to be spent on a challenging academic education for these country folk. No, Gates said, we shall not search for great artists, musicians, doctors, statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. The task is very simple. We will organize children and teach them to do in a perfect way the things their fathers and mothers are doing in an imperfect way. That organizational plan was to separate the people into at least two distinct classes, and education was the tool that was to be used to do it. Consider this statement that was made by President Woodrow Wilson in a speech to businessmen just prior to World War I. We want one class to have a liberal education. We want another class, a very much larger class of necessity, to forgo the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. In 1922, New York Mayor John Hillen described the Rockefeller Foundation that had seized the schools as, quote, an invisible government, unquote.